Section 5, Under Positive Leadership. Yesterday morning, we began with the scoreboard showing the present level of communist advance. Then we looked at the two underlying trends, the progress of the disease of collectivism and the loss of real faith, which in the long run could be more fatal than the onslaught of the communist conspiracy. In the afternoon, we began another look at the same things with remedial action in mind rather than diagnosis. We outlined some needed steps for facing up to the communist threat. This morning, in continuing that retracing of our footsteps, we come first to the cancer of collectivism, to the question of how to stop its further ravages and how to restore the American body politic to good health, renewed strength, and as much promise for the future as is possible in view of the damage already done. And that, gentlemen, brings me to one of the basic purposes for which this meeting was called. It is one which I approach with great humility, but with no misgivings as to its necessity. For we simply are not going to be able to save our country from either the immediate threat of communism or the long-range threat of socialism by organizational leadership. Our only possible chance is dynamic personal leadership. Let me begin with an illustration of the difference, which also supports the argument. In 1952, I disagreed with Bob Taft on at least 3 of his 10 most important political principles, especially with regard to federal housing and United States government aid to Israel. I was diametrically opposed to policies he advocated. Yet I made 25 radio speeches for Taft in the primary campaign on my own time and my own money. Nor was this done at all on the let's take the lesser of two evils theory. I was wholeheartedly and enthusiastically for Taft, for the nomination and the presidency, because I trusted him and he was going generally in my direction. The fact that he didn't see 2 or 3 issues out of 10 the way I saw them didn't dampen the energy of my personal support for him in the slightest. But if and when I am a member of any organization, political or otherwise, and there is disagreement on the part of any sizable percentage of the membership as to 3 out of 10 of the organization's policies or planks, a splintering of the organization into 2 groups is almost inevitable. In eastern Massachusetts, there was quite a live and energetic outfit of some 700 members called the Friends of Senator McCarthy. I have seen another organization called American Patriots splinter off from the original one and then resplinter into a larger and smaller group, while the remnant of the first organization went to pieces. But if McCarthy was still alive, and if all the members of the organization had to agree on was support of a personal leader, there would probably be 1,000 working members of that organization today, despite exactly the same basic disagreements over various principles between them. When Frank Lausche, running as a Democrat, was elected governor of Ohio the last time, there must have been hundreds of thousands of Ohio Democrats who voted for him, despite their vigorous disagreement with him over his support of Taft and of the Taft-Hartley Act. But if the Democratic Party of Ohio, an organization, had tried to take a position in support of the Taft-Hartley Act, it would have split the party wide open and have made it practically useless in the campaign. Personal leadership holds together a following in the way that organizational leadership never can. Now, we are surfeited in this country today with organizations opposing communism or socialism. Leave out of consideration for the minute the extent to which they are handicapped by being almost entirely defensive. For while Napoleon was quite correct when he said that the purely defensive is doomed to defeat, that is another part of our story which we are coming to later. The point here is that none of these organizations alone, nor all of them together, nor all of them even if they were combined into one organization without initial loss of total strength, has any possibility of stopping the enemy. Most of them, frankly, do not have any possibility of even enough piecemeal accomplishment in the total fight to justify the money and energy expended on them. For usually there is no sufficiently inspired personal leadership of the organization itself to obtain the greatest unanimity of purpose, efficiency, and enthusiasm which are necessary in connection with the expenditure of resources. And of course, the one central direction and coordination of all these groups, which is so vital to avoid waste, is entirely lacking. What is more, even if all of the 700 known groups could be and were combined into one organization for the very purpose of obtaining centralized coordination, this central direction and coordination would still be lacking or grossly inefficient and insufficient so long as the combination was run as an organization. Only if the members of these groups declared allegiance to, came to feel an unshakable loyalty for, and thus accepted direction from a dynamic personal leader, only under these conditions would there be any possibility of the members of these groups and of all other Americans who feel basically as they do, supplying what is needed. That is, the strength and dedication which can turn back the communists in front, and which, with the benefit of the momentum thus gained, can turn back the socialists behind the communists. At present, we are in the position of trying to defeat a disciplined, well-armed, expertly commanded army with a collection of debating societies, and it can't be done. Before we leave this point, let's use an illustration. And you pick it. You simply take in your own mind some patriotic organization which you know about, or perhaps in which you participate. Let's call it the XYZ Association. And no matter which one of the anti-communist or anti-socialist groups you select, the chances are that the good citizens who put it together are friends of mine. They almost certainly are dedicated patriots who deserve our gratitude and our praise. And I not only wish for them and their organization all possible success, but will help in any way I can towards increasing their effectiveness. But let's be realistic. Ask yourself honestly about whatever organization you have in mind. Where is it going? Even if there were any clear consensus of opinion within the organization itself as to where it wanted to go, how much continued drive and concerted effort to that end do you think could be maintained? Who's going to die for the XYZ Association or the blank committee? We are fast coming to a point, gentlemen, where we've got to offer something that people are willing to die for. And only over long periods of time, and then in rare instances, do you generate and maintain loyalty for an organization that is even in the same league with loyalty for an individual. But, you may say, look at the success and the terrific influence that has been exercised by some of the organizations on the other side, such as the ADA, for instance, the Americans for Democratic Action. But the ADA, whether a lot of its members know it or not, is the same as an arm of the Communist Party. Its weight can be thrown, and is thrown time after time with never an exception, in support of communist objectives. It has the benefit of the direction of a nerve system of that body which runs all the way to the top. But what is the XYZ Association an arm of, or the blank committee? It's a lonesome boy standing on the beach with a big broom, trying to rush back the waves that are about to flood the whole shoreline of beautiful houses. There are other boys with brooms and shovels and buckets all up and down the beach doing the same thing. What is not only needed, but is absolutely imperative, is for some hard-boiled, dictatorial, and dynamic boss to come along and deliver himself approximately as follows. Quote, "Hey, you guys, all of you, drop those pretty brooms. You fellows down there on the end, start running for empty bags and keep bringing more empty bags as fast as you can find them. Make them out of sheets and tablecloths if you have to, or get them any other way. Just get them. You fellows in those next two groups, start filling those bags with sand. You men here, all of you, start lugging those bags of sand to put on this wall the communists have busted up so badly. And don't spare your backs. Build it high and build it quick, even if it is only with sandbags for the present. You fellows over there, all of you, get the heaviest clubs you can find, spread yourselves out no more thinly than you have to along the whole length of this wall, and don't hesitate to break the heads of any saboteurs you find monkeying with it. Don't even hesitate to break the heads of those you find creeping towards the wall if you are sure of their evil intentions. This is a warning to the rest of the dirty gang. If everybody puts everything he's got into the job without stopping to argue, we'll be able to save these beautiful houses from this incoming flood. We'll not have just ruins left, no longer worth saving, when it recedes. But the minute we have the sandbags high enough, All of you fellows get to work at once, bringing rocks and cement, and rebuilding this whole wall, both higher and solider than it ever was before. Then, the next time a combination of tide storm and saboteurs comes in, we'll be ready for them. And once all of this is done, you can again start enjoying those beautiful homes you will have saved." Unquote. Human nature being what it is, there is no question about how much more energetically, determinedly, or confidently the men on the beach would work under such leadership, nor about how many more men would immediately be attracted to rebuilding the wall and breaking the heads of the saboteurs under such direction. But, gentlemen, if you're going to wait for those boys and men with the brooms to form an association for rebuilding the wall, and for it then to be repaired and guarded under organizational and committee control, you might as well start telling the communists to stake out their claims on the ruins of the former beautiful houses right now. But that figure of speech has outlived its usefulness, so let's get down to plain language again. Let's look briefly at the possibility, the advantages, and the disadvantages of finding this desperately needed leader in the political field. And the easiest way to do this is to conduct the discussion around some individual from the very start. Now, the one man who comes nearest to measuring up to all the needs and qualifications whom we see on the political horizon at the present time is Barry Goldwater. I know Barry fairly well. He is a great American. As I foresaw a year ago how the Rutherite left would concentrate national strength and resources on the Arizona campaign, and how important money from outside Arizona would be towards enabling Goldwater to meet that attack adequately, I took it on myself to become a one-man finance committee for him in Massachusetts. I raised around $2,000 in my state and sent it on to him early in 1958. Now, $2,000 isn't much, but Massachusetts is a long way from Arizona, and the so-called upper crust of eastern Massachusetts are probably the most provincially and smugly ignorant of what is really happening today of any similar group in the United States. At any rate, through the efforts of a lot of other people in other states who either had or were given the same idea, Barry had enough money and had it early enough to put on a bang-up professional campaign, one that was successful for a Republican in a strongly Democratic state against everything Walter Reuther could throw at him. Barry Goldwater has political know-how and the painstaking genius to use that know-how with regard to infinite details. He is a superb political organizer and inspires deep and lasting loyalty. He is absolutely sound in his Americanism, has the political and moral courage to stand by his Americanist principles, and in my opinion can be trusted to stand by them until hell freezes over. I'd love to see him President of the United States, and maybe someday we shall. But does anybody in this room think there is any slightest chance of Barry Goldwater supplying the dynamic overall leadership needed to save this country for anybody to be president of? If so, I think he is still not fully aware of the nature and totality of the forces at work. For Goldwater, by the very circumstances of his political success, present prestige, and the expectations of his supporters, will inevitably think and move in terms of political warfare. Even if he personally should reach the point and the understanding of wanting to consider political action as just a part, no matter how important, of much broader overall action, how much chance do you think there is that his friends and supporters would let him step out of the strictly political role in which he has been so successful? How much chance is there that they would let him build and utilize forceful leadership on all of the other fronts where we must fight the communists? How many of the steps which we discussed yesterday afternoon, and which I am sure must be taken if we are to have any chance at all, do you think you could count on Barry Goldwater's leadership to bring about, no matter how much he was beseeched, and no matter how much he himself came to feel inclined to do so? Or let's go at it another way. Suppose you feel that the political factor in the equation is so important that it overweighs all of the others, and that if we could get a man like Barry Goldwater nominated and elected president, or Bill Nolan, or Bill Jenner, or any one of a dozen others for that matter, by 1960, or even maybe by 1964, the power of the presidency in the hands of such a man would be enough to save our country. Do you think that by strictly political means and without the help of all of the other efforts on all of the other fronts, there would be the slightest chance of bringing this about? That with the present shattered condition of the Republican Party and the grip of the leftists inside both parties on various pieces of those parties, there is going to be any slightest chance of getting a solid, courageous, uncompromising Americanist nominated by either party unless there are huge, compelling forces at work outside of the parties which are not affected by the ubiquitous opportunism inside the parties. If anybody in this room believes that with the slowing down of the rapidly rising communist influence left to the organizations in the field, and with the restoring of republicanism in the Republican Party left to the politicians, there is the slightest chance of our having anything but a left-wing president in 1961, then I would be greatly surprised. We've been counting on that kind of salvation, and hence going steadily down the drain for 20 years. Or, more for the other illustrative points that will arise than for any hopes offered by the prospect, let's look at Richard Nixon in this connection. He is an extremely smart man. He is one of the ablest, shrewdest, most disingenuous, and slipperiest politicians that ever showed up on the American scene. He can sit in Washington one night and convince some of the most, quote, modern, unquote, Republicans that he is the best ball carrier they have, and spend 4 hours in the Waldorf Towers the next day convincing MacArthur and Herbert Hoover that he is their man. He can use the tremendously overrated and overpublicized, but actually highly cautious part he played in the Alger Hiss exposure to hang on to the hopeful loyalty of the vigorous anti-communists at the very time when he is insinuating himself into the good graces of the left by quietly knifing McCarthy. Nixon could pose as a conservative Republican congressman and yet be one of the original founders in 1950 of Republican Advance. This was intended to be not the Republican opposition to, but the Republican teammate of Americans for Democratic Action, and it even had some interlocking left-wingers who were members of both groups. Nixon can claim still to be vigorously anti-communist, yet when he has a chance as vice president to break the tie and cast the decisive vote for H.R. 3, to reestablish some chance of prosecution of subversives actually advocating violent overthrow of our government, what happens? He moves heaven and earth to have Wallace Bennett found and pressured into voting against H.R. 3, defeating the measure so that the vice president will not have to vote. What good would such a man be to us, even as president, unless outside forces and accomplishments made it opportunistic and expedient for him to ride an anti-communist wave which those outside forces had created? As for being a leader, the sad truth, hard for many hopeful and wishful conservative Republicans to realize, is that Richard Nixon, a most engaging personality and clever politician, has never been a leader in connection with any event or development or at any stage in his career. He has been a rider of waves, so far as public support was concerned, without caring whether the particular wave at any given time was moving left or right, and a manipulator of uncanny skill behind the scenes. Nixon always brings to my mind the old gag that a wife is a person who helps you to get over all the troubles you wouldn't have had if you had never married. Or the somewhat more elegant version that diplomats help us to solve our problems that never would have arisen if there were no diplomats. But for the dirtiest deal in American political history, participated in, if not actually engineered by Richard Nixon, in order to make himself vice president and to put Warren on the Supreme Court as part of that deal, Taft would have been nominated at Chicago in 1952. It is almost certain that Taft would then have been elected president by a far greater plurality than was Eisenhower, that a grand rout of the communists in our government and in our midst would have been started, that McCarthy would be alive today, and that we wouldn't even be in this mess that we are supposed to look to Nixon to lead us out of. And in appraising Richard Nixon's character, nobody should overlook the vicious undercover knifing of Bill Nolan by Nixon's men in California in the campaign just finished. And this is not surmise, gentlemen, but definite fact observed at first hand by stalwart Republicans in California, some of whom were personal friends of Nixon and at first just could not believe what they were seeing. They came to believe it all right, for Nixon was determined to get rid of Nolan once and for all, and at any cost, as a possible contender for control of the California delegation and for the nomination in 1960. This despite the fact that from the day Nixon landed in Washington as a freshman congressman, Nobody had been nicer to him or helped him in more ways than the well-loved senator from his own state, Bill Nolan. Now, please do not project my remarks about Nixon beyond their intended purpose. He may be the best bet we have for the Republican standard-bearer in 1960 who has any chance of getting the nomination. He would be far better than Nelson Rockefeller. For while I think Nixon would ride any wave to the right or left that seemed likely to carry him farthest, I don't think he would be committed to personally helping to make the wave go left, as I think Nelson Rockefeller would be. I think Nixon could become a very patriotic anti-communist if we could create circumstances in which it would be smart politics to be one, whereas I think Nelson Rockefeller would fight for further movement towards the internationalist left under any and all circumstances. I think Nelson Rockefeller is definitely committed to trying to make the United States a part of a one-world socialist government, while I don't think Nixon is committed to anything other than the career of Richard Nixon. In that, he is neither better nor worse than most other politicians, merely smarter. I can foresee possibilities where every one of us would work for him and vote for him in 1960, despite what I have said, as if, for instance, he were the Republican candidate against Walter Reuther, or even Reuther's stooge, Jack Kennedy, on the Democratic ticket. For this reason, I do not intend to put those remarks about Nixon on any tape recording I might make from these notes, but I have made them here in this really inner circle group in order to emphasize the wisdom of the old advice, quote, "Put not your faith in politicians," unquote. We should have to use politicians, support politicians, create politicians, and help the best ones we can find to get elected. I am thoroughly convinced, however, that we cannot count on politicians, political leadership, or even political action, except as a part of something much deeper and broader to save us. Now, I didn't always feel that way, and I think that, up to the time the nomination was stolen from Bob Taft in 1952, it was still possible to have saved our country from the immediate communist danger anyway, primarily by political action. And up until a few months ago, I was still giving some thought to starting some quiet but strong non-political organizing for political purposes right in Massachusetts, with a view to either capturing the Republican nomination for the Senate from Saltonstall in 1960 or running as an independent as circumstances then indicated. The further idea was to try to go to the United States Senate by supreme effort to that end and there make such contribution as one outspoken senator could towards stemming the tide. But my study of the whole picture convinced me more and more that, one, no one outspoken senator, nor a dozen outspoken senators, and no amount of the ephemeral political support they might muster could possibly save our country unless there was, encompassing them and their efforts and support, this far larger and broader movement to which I keep referring. Two, that there was not going to be any such movement without the dynamic overall personal leadership to which I have also been referring, and three, that with all of my own shortcomings, there wasn't anybody else on the horizon willing to give their whole lives to the job with the determination and dedication I would put into it if I didn't. What really moved me to cross this Rubicon, however, the consideration which more than any other gradually brought me the necessary measure of courage and determination for so staggering an undertaking, was another result of many years of study of not only the present but the past. This is the conviction that even warding off communist slavery and reversing the socialist trend is only half the battle. We can never win even that half, unless both leadership and following have a positive dream which is more important as a hope than the negative nightmare is as a fear, unless the promise of what we can build supplies more motivation than the terror of what we must destroy, and unless this faith in the future is based on a deeper faith in eternal truths. The nature of these truths and the tenets of this faith, which I hope and believe every man in this room can accept and approve, I shall come to later this morning. What I'm trying to do here, as an introduction to and part of our thinking about how to rid America of the collectivist cancer, is simply this. I want to convince you, as I am convinced, that only dynamic personal leadership offers any chance for us to save either our material or our spiritual inheritance. I want to convince you, as I am convinced, that even under such leadership we have no chance unless the specific battles are fought as part of a larger and more lasting movement to restore once again an upward reach to the heart of man. And I have wished to make clear what you are bound to be assuming already, that with whatever I have in me of faith, dedication, and energy, I intend to offer that leadership to all who are willing to help me. Section 6. To restore responsibility. With that much explanation as background, let's see what basic principle we can establish and what specific objective we can define with regard to the particular battle against collectivism, which would be sure to fit into and be encompassed by our general overall permanent purpose, although that total spiritual aspiration is as yet only foreshadowed. For thus making sharp and clear one part of our philosophy and program, where a concrete area of action is involved, will itself help to build a better understanding of the whole. And it seems to me, gentlemen, that the whole essence of our purpose and the guiding principle for our action, covering not only our fight against collectivism, but our fight for our constructive replacement, can be summarized in the objective expressed by just 5 words: less government and more responsibility. The principle is simple enough for all to understand. The direction signs leading to the goal expressed are clear enough for nobody to misjudge them. An honest adherence to that principle and those directions, against which to test either candidates or issues, will settle in the minds of our followers and ourselves almost all questions which may arise concerning either candidates or issues in the field of political effort. And yet it is broad enough, I believe, to be comprehensive with regard to all that we really desire to attain through political action. Less government and more responsibility. I mean less government of every kind, federal, state, or municipal, and more true responsibility, not only on the part of individuals, but on the part of such reduced governmental units as are necessarily permitted to exist. But of course I mean primarily less federal government, because that is where our greatest danger lies, and more individual responsibility, because that is our greatest need. And now I want to give you some of the arguments and the reasoning by which we must try to inculcate this fundamental principle of less government and more responsibility into the minds of our contemporaries and successors. For we must try to make it a convincing political standard and an accepted goal on the part of not only our own dedicated followers, who go all the way with our principles and our ideals, of which this is only a segment. We must try to rally behind this concept thousands or possibly millions of anxious citizens who show a vital interest in their politically determined future, but are yet to be won to a dedication to ideals of more spiritual breadth. So again, without your leave, I am going to utilize a few extracts from a talk I made a couple of years ago at a convocation of students and faculty of Dickinson College. I do so simply because, having put a lot of work into the preparation of that speech, I can cover the present ground more succinctly and quickly by quoting from it than in any other way. And this part is not long. What we must start asking our fellow citizens everywhere to consider as of overwhelming importance to the future of themselves and their families is this: on the basis of all known past human experience, are there any general conclusions with regard to the organization of society which can be set forth with confidence? It seems to me clear that there certainly are. First, government is necessary, some degree of government in any civilized society. There are believers in the possibility and desirability of a governmentless anarchy as a practicable form of human association. But the number of these advocates is comparatively very small. There is no evidence within human historical experience to support their thesis, and there is considerable evidence indicating otherwise. Second, while government is necessary, it is basically a non-productive expense, an overhead cost supported by the productive economy, and like all overhead items, it always has a tendency to expand faster than the productive base which supports it. Third, government is frequently evil, and we do not mean by this that they, governments, are merely dishonest, for all governments, with very rare exceptions indeed, are thoroughly dishonest. We made the statement in print about 2 years ago that there has never in the history of the world been a government and this generalization includes our present one, that maintained honesty in the handling of a managed, irredeemable currency. A few weeks later, one of America's ablest and best-known economists quoted that statement with full approval. But what we are talking about here is something far worse than dishonesty. In December 1956, Professor Sorokin of Harvard, after quoting Lord Acton, that great men in the political arena are almost always bad men, went on to reveal the results of his own survey of the criminality of rulers. This survey of the monarchs of various countries and the heads of various republics and democracies, in a selection large enough to constitute a very fair sample, revealed that there was an average of one murderer to every 4 of these rulers. In other words, said Professor Sorokin, quote, the rulers of the states are the most criminal group in a respective population. With a limitation of their power, their criminality tends to decrease, but it still remains exceptionally high in all nations, unquote. An obvious reason for this is the greater temptation to criminality on the part of those who control or influence the police power of a nation, of which they would otherwise stand in more fear. Another is that ambitious men with criminal tendencies naturally gravitate into government because of this very prospect of doing or helping to do the policing over themselves. A third reason is that so many apologists can always be found for criminal acts of governments, on the grounds that such acts ultimately contribute to the public good, and that therefore the criminal means are justified by the righteous ends. Kavatilya wrote his Arthashastra in about 300 B.C. Machiavelli wrote his Il Principe in about 1500 A.D., and the arguments of both, that it is a virtue in a ruler to be unscrupulous for the good of his state, are heard in every age. Fourth, government is always and inevitably an enemy of individual freedom. It seems rather strange that it was Woodrow Wilson who more than any other one man started this nation on its present road towards totalitarianism, who also said that the history of human liberty is a history of the limitations of governmental power, not the increase of it. But Wilson could have boasted, as did Charles II of England, that he said only wise things, even though he did only foolish ones. It is self-evident that government, by its very nature, must be an enemy of freedom, edging always towards a restriction of the individual's rights and responsibilities. 5. Whatever must be done by government will always cost more than if it could be done by individuals or smaller groups. And the larger the government, the more disproportionate will be the cost. Letting a government do anything, therefore, which such individuals or smaller groups could properly do is serious economic wastefulness. It is also contrary to the philosophy of the proper function of government that is derived from the whole body of past experiments. 6. Government, by its size, its momentum, and its authority, will not only perpetuate errors of doctrine or of policy longer than they would otherwise retain acceptance, but it will multiply their effect on a geometric scale as against the arithmetically cumulative effect of those errors if confined to individuals or smaller groups. The errors of tens of thousands of individuals, all thinking and probing in different directions and moved by different impulses, tend to cancel themselves out or to be softened by the attrition of doubt and disagreement. But let any one error become sanctified by government and thus crystallized as truth, and little short of a revolution can discredit it or cause it to be discarded. An easy illustration of this principle is the witchcraft terror in the early days of the colonial government of Massachusetts. If there had been no governmental power to give phantasmagoria the semblance of reality by official decree, the common sense of a majority of the citizens would have kept this manifestation of fanaticism from ever having such widespread support and cruel results. But once government had authoritatively said, quote, "This is truth," unquote, then the hitherto doubting citizen was willing to join others like himself in accepting it as truth. And we have at least a dozen idiocies, equally repugnant to man's common sense and sound experience, being perpetuated by our government in Washington today. 7. As any society becomes reasonably settled, and shakes down into a semi-permanent pattern of economic and political life, and as some degree of leisure on the part of its citizens becomes both possible and visible, the drive always begins to have government become the management of the social enterprise rather than merely its agent for certain clear purposes. Government is then increasingly allowed, invited, and even urged to do planning for and exercise control over the total economy of the nation. Next, it is pushed and pushes itself more and more into planning and control of the separate activities of the citizens and groups of citizens that make up the economic life of the nation. And in doing such planning and exercising such controls, the government must assume more and more of the responsibility for the success of the economy and the welfare of its citizens. Of course, no government, short of being omniscient, can ever plan the specialized division of labor and the beneficial interchange of the various products of human effort, or can ever appraise the impact of changing circumstances and changing desires on the infinite ramifications of interrelated human activity one half as well as the planning, appraising, and resulting corrections will be accomplished by a completely free market if given the opportunity. For the free market automatically weighs, measures, and integrates into its decisions increments of need, of difficulty, and of motivation that are too small, too numerous, and too hidden for the planners ever to discover them. And the equations to be dealt with are too infinite to be resolved by any human brain or committee of human brains, even if all the variables and constants could be accurately set forth in such equations. A government trying to step in and improve the workings of a free market is exactly like a man who takes a lighted lantern outdoors at noon of a bright June day to show you the sun. But a government's answer to any criticism as to the inadequacy of the lantern is always to bring more lanterns and then more lanterns until eventually the smoke and glare of the lanterns so seriously interfere with and shut off the light of the sun that everybody actually has to work mainly by lantern light. It is interesting to note, too, that in any society, the government and its allies who want to use the lanterns always claim the justification that the society's economy is more complex than those which have preceded it. They insist that, therefore, the lanterns of planning and control are necessary and helpful now, no matter how futile and harmful they have been shown to be in the past. Of course, exactly the opposite is true. The more complex the economic life of a nation becomes, the more nearly infinite the shades and grades of impulse which determine the proper interchanges and relationships between its components become, then the more impossible and ridiculous is any undertaking to plan and control those relationships, and the more the automatic working of a completely free market is needed. 8. As a government increases in power, and as a means of increasing its power, it always has a tendency to squeeze out the middle class, to destroy or weaken the middle for the benefit of the top and the bottom. Even where there is no conscious alliance for this purpose, such as formed the basis for Bismarck's beginning of the socialization of Germany, of Franklin Roosevelt's beginning of the socialization of America, the forces to that end are always at work, as they have been in England for 50 years. In the nations that the gods would destroy, they first make the middle class helpless through insidious but irresistible government pressures. 9. The form of government is not nearly so important as its quality. Justice and a lack of arbitrariness, for instance, are two characteristics of a government that are most important to the welfare and happiness of a people. They are as likely to be found, or more accurately, as little likely to be found, under any one form of government as another. Rampant interference with personal lives is the most obnoxious characteristic of any government, and that is found just as readily under elected officials as under hereditary monarchs. In fact, as the Greeks pointed out, and as has been well known to careful students of history ever since, and as the founding fathers of our own republic were well aware, when an elected government succeeds in attracting and maintaining an overwhelming majority behind it for any length of time, its mob instincts make it the most tyrannical of all forms of social organization. Incidentally, a tragic result of the emphasis placed by historians and statesmen on the form of the American government has been the emulation by newly independent Asiatic nations of the wrong thing in our American system. admiring the tremendous success of the United States, observing the unprecedented prosperity, freedom, and opportunities for happiness on the part of the people, looking up to the United States as the example to be followed, nation after nation in other parts of the world, but especially in Asia, has copied the American government for itself. Its budding political scientists have felt that this must be the key to national success and greatness, as it clearly would have been if they had copied the right thing, the very thing that made America great. But what these new nations have taken for themselves are carbon copies of the American government at the time their own governments were being established. In far too many cases, this has been since the New Deal had completely stultified the original virtues of the American government. The Philippines, for instance, in 1948, took over every form of welfarism and every stifling regulation and suppression of private enterprise and substitute, therefore, which Roosevelt's New Dealers had been able to impose on us, even with a war to help them. The results were and still are pathetic, simply because they had been led to believe that it was the form of the American government which counted. But actually, it had been the small amount of government in America throughout its centuries of mushrooming productivity, not the form of that government, which had been the vital factor of success. The Filipinos and others like them took over instead the excesses of government, which were already in a fair way to start the decline of America itself. 10. Which brings us to the last, the most overlooked, and in my opinion the most important of all these basic generalizations concerning government. Thomas Jefferson expressed part of it in his famous dictum that that government is best which governs least. But Jefferson was thinking of the extent of a government's power more than of the extensiveness of the government itself. And our 10th point is that neither the form of government nor its quality is as important as its quantity. A thoroughly foul government like that of Nero, which still did not reach its tentacles too far into the daily lives and doings of its subjects, was far better for the Roman Empire in the long run than the intentionally benevolent government of Diocletian or of Constantine, whose bureaucratic agents were everywhere. Let's dramatize this fact, our opinion, by bringing it closer home. And your speaker would like to have it understood that he does not condone dishonesty in the slightest degree. Yet I had rather have for America, and I am convinced America would be better off with, a government of 300,000 officials and agents, every single one of them a thief, than a government of 3 million agents, with every single one of them an honest, honorable public servant. For the first group would only steal from the American economic and political system. The second group would be bound in time to destroy it. The increasing quantity of government in all nations has constituted the greatest tragedy of the 20th century. Let's spotlight just one particular result of this tragic development, which has occurred in connection with man's age-old worry, war. That result is the frequency, the length, the extensiveness, the horrible destructiveness, and the totality of impact on the population of the wars of the 20th century. In the physical sciences, we are accustomed to using combined measurements, such as foot-pounds, kilowatt-hours, or man-days. Let's invent such a phrase for the measurement of war and call it the day-number horror unit. In the use of that three-way calculation, we multiply the days of suffering by the number of people who suffer by the depth of the suffering to arrive at an appraisal. Then I believe you will find that pretty generally throughout history, despite other factors causing occasional exceptions, and very definitely throughout recent centuries, the day-number horrors measure of any war has been proportional to the contemporary extensiveness of government. In fact, and specifically, it has been directly proportional to the product of the quantities of government in the nations involved at the time a war was fought. Also, you will find that it is the huge quantity of government which, more than anything else, makes these tremendously destructive wars not only possible, but unavoidable. One illustration should make this statement too clear for argument. Do you want to fight the Russian people? Do you think the Russian people have the least desire to fight us? Do you think there would be the slightest chance of the American people and the Russian people fighting each other, with millions to be killed on both sides and great parts of both countries probably to be utterly destroyed, if there were only 1/10 as much government in each country as now exists? Stop and think about it for a minute. It is not only that governments carry their peoples into horrible and utterly unnecessary wars, but it takes a very huge quantity of government to carry its people into the totalitarian struggle which war has now been made by this same quantity of government. Reduce all the governments of all the nations of the world to 1/3 of their present size, not 1/3 of their power, note, nor are we referring to their quality, but just to 1/3 of their bureaucratic numbers, their extensiveness, their meddling in the lives of their subjects, and you would immediately accomplish two things. You would reduce the likelihood of war between hostile nations to at most 1/9 of its present probability, and the destructiveness of any wars that did take place in the same proportion. The greatest enemy of man is and always has been government, and the larger, the more extensive that government, the greater the enemy. Now, clearly the United States, which throughout its early centuries was the greatest beneficiary from the scarcity of government that the world has ever known, should not only return to the right course for its own further growth in prosperity, freedom, and happiness, but should set an example again for the whole world. In fact, the word Americanist with a small a should be made and become understood as the very antithesis of socialism and communism with a little c. For the communist, using the word now with a little c to denote a theoretician rather than a member of the conspiracy, the communist believes that a collectivist society should swallow up all individuals, make their lives and their energies completely subservient to the needs and the purposes of the collectivist state, and that any means are permissible to achieve this end. The true Americanist believes that the individual should retain the freedom to make his own bargain with life, and the responsibility for the results of that bargain, and that means are as important as ends in the civilized social order which he desires. The same two words with initial capitals, communists and Americanists, should merely denote the aggressive fighters for these two mutually exclusive philosophies. But Americanism, as either a phrase or a force on the contemporary world scene, has been eroded into something negative and defeatist. It has come to represent merely a delaying action against the victorious march of its enemy, collectivism. The air is full of clarion calls to Americans to organize in order better to fight against socialism, communism, or some vanguard of their forces. Twice each day the mail brings to my desk pleas for me to contribute money or effort or moral support or all three to some group which is battling to hold back some particular advance of collectivist stormtroops. Even those organizations or activities which bear a positive label are motivated by negative thinking. An association for the Bricker Amendment is in reality an association against the intervention of international socialist forces in the control of our domestic lives. Americanism has become primarily a denial of something else rather than an assertion of itself. And there are many of us who think that this should be true no longer. We think that Americanism should again come to mean and to be a positive, forward-looking philosophy, a design and example of social organization which boldly and confidently offers leadership along the one hard but sure road to a better world. It is not just in the United States, of course, that all the aggressiveness is on the side of the socialist communist allies. In the worldwide ideological struggle which divides mankind today, we conservatives fight always on the defensive. The very name by which we identify ourselves defines our objective. It is to conserve as much as we can out of all we have inherited that is worthwhile from the encroachments and destructiveness of this advancing collectivism. We build no more icons to freedom. We merely try to fend off the iconoclast. Such has been the pattern during the whole first half of the 20th century. From the bright plateaus of individual freedom and individual responsibility, which man had precariously attained, there has been a steady falling back towards the dark valleys of dependence and serfdom. But this ignominious retreat has been just as true of Americans, the heirs of a strong new society, as of the tired residual legatees of an old and enfeebled European civilization. During this long and forced retreat, we have fought only a rear guard and sometimes delaying action. We have never been rallied to counterattack, to break through the enemy or rout him, and to climb again beyond our highest previous gains. And in the unending skirmishes, to hold as much as possible of the ground currently occupied, we have lost all sight of the higher tablelands of freedom which once were our recognized goals. I, for one, and many others like me, are no longer willing to consider only when to retreat and how far. There is a braver and a wiser course. If we, heirs of all the ages, are to find a turning point in this rapid and sometimes stampeding descent, in which we are abandoning instead of improving our inheritance, if the last half of the 20th century is to see the curve that measures individual dignity turn upward, if the men who really wish to be free and self-reliant are to begin climbing back up the mountainside, then the goal must be known, and the purpose of aggressive offense must replace defensive defeatism as the banner under which we march. It is fatal to be merely against losing ground, for then there is no way to go but back. We have to be for something. We must know what that something is, and we must believe it is worth a fight to obtain. Reduced to its simplest and broadest terms, that something is less government and more responsibility. For both less government and more responsibility bring increasing opportunities for human happiness. Due to the tremendous momentum given us by our hard-working, ambitious, and individualistic forefathers, our nation is still by far the most dynamic in the world in its productive processes and in its influences on the whole world's standard of living. We must again become equally dynamic in our spiritual influence, in our positive leadership and example, to provide a governmental environment in which individual man can make the most of his life in whatever way he, and not his government, wishes to use it. There are many stages of welfarism, socialism, and collectivism in general, but communism is the ultimate state of them all, and they all lead inevitably in that direction. In this final stage, communism, you have a society in which class distinctions are greater than in any other, but where position in these classes is determined solely by demagogic political skill and ruthless cunning. You have a society in which all those traits which have helped to make man civilized, and which our multiple faiths have classified as virtues, are now discarded as vices, while exactly their opposites are glorified. And you have a society in which every fault of government that we have discussed above is held to be a benefit and a desirable part of the framework of life. But there is an exactly opposite direction. It leads towards a society in which brotherhood and kindness and tolerance and honesty and self-reliance and the integrity of the human personality are considered virtues, a society which venerates those traits exactly because they have helped the human animal to achieve some degree of humanitarian civilization and are the common denominators of all our great religions. This direction leads toward a governmental environment for human life founded on the basis of long experience with government, on experience which shows government to be a necessary evil, but a continuous brake on all progress and the ultimate enemy of all freedom. It is the forward direction, the upward direction, and Americanism, I hope, shall become its name. There, gentlemen, is our argument, or that part of it which applies, as I think it should be used in the political field primarily for political purposes. To make it heard by and really understood by enough millions of Americans is a colossal undertaking. But who says it cannot be done? For who has really tried? We have all been fiddling around with halfway measures, with compromise measures, with delaying actions, instead of getting down to fundamental principles, standing on them with firmness, and remembering that future history is always determined by minorities who really know what they want. The whole New Deal march towards state socialism has been carried through and advanced to its present stage by a determined minority. We can bring about the necessary reversal of this trend if we, as a minority for what is right, stand as firm, work as hard, and give to the principles in which we believe the same dedication as has the sophomoric minority of so-called liberals which brought us to our present crisis. The question is not really whether we can expunge this disease of collectivism and make America strong and healthy and a true example for all the world again, but whether we think it is worth the Herculean effort the sacrifice and dedication that would be required. I think it would, and I am hoping you think so too.